The document arrived at 0347 station time, and by 0349, I had already decided that whoever wrote it had never once in their long, spacefaring lives met a species that could say no and mean it. I am Commander Yael Doran. I serve the United Nations Envoy Division, Earth Fleet. I am writing this account 6 months after the events concluded, because the UN Secretary General asked me to, and also because if I do not write it down, I will spend the rest of my life telling this story at dinner parties, and no one will believe me anyway. Let me start at the exact moment everything began. The signal came in on a quantum-locked frequency that our deep space arrays had never detected before. It was not a greeting. It was not a hello. There was no preamble, no introduction, no polite opener about the weather or the state of the cosmos. It was a document, 14 pages long, formatted with the cold precision of something written by a committee that had been writing documents like this for a very, very long time. The title, translated through our algorithmic linguistic processors in about 40 seconds, read, Compliance Mandate, Directive 7741C, issued by the Galactic Conclave of Sovereign Civilizations, Office of Integration and Expansion Management. I read it twice. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down in my chair aboard the EFS Resolute, and read it a third time, because I wanted to make sure I was understanding correctly. I was. The Galactic Conclave, a coalition of 11 spacefaring civilizations whose combined age of interstellar cooperation stretched back roughly 3,000 years, had decided that humanity needed to be managed. The document was thorough. It was detailed. It had footnotes. It referenced 17 prior integration cases and pointed out, with considerable satisfaction, that all 17 had ultimately complied with conclave directives. Some had taken longer than others. None had refused outright. The demands were specific. Humanity was to immediately suspend all faster-than-light propulsion research. We were to transfer all antimatter energy stockpiles to a conclave-designated holding facility within 60 days. We were to impose hard population limits on our outer colony expansion, defined as any settlement beyond what the document called the approved human sphere, a zone that, I noted with some interest, was about 1/3 the size of the zone we had already colonized. We were to send a formal diplomatic delegation to Conclave Station Vereth within 90 days to begin what the document warmly described as supervised integration proceedings. At the bottom of page 12, almost as an afterthought, there was a short section titled Historical Precedent. It listed 4 civilizations that had initially resisted integration. It described, in calm, bureaucratic language, what had subsequently happened to them. It was not written as a direct threat. It did not need to be. The implication was perfectly clear. I forwarded the document to Earth with a priority flag and a single line of personal commentary. Read carefully before responding. Then I waited. The response from the UN Security Council came back in 11 hours. That was fast. Historically, the Security Council does not agree on anything in under 11 hours. The fact that they had reached a unanimous position in less than half a day told me something important before I even read the message. The message was 4 words long. We are not interested. That was it. No counter-proposal. No request for clarification. No opening of a dialogue. No expression of concern about the historical precedent section on page 12. 4 words, sent back on the same quantum-locked frequency, and then silence. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about all the training I had received in diplomatic engagement, the years of study, the simulations, the careful protocols for first contact. I thought about how every model we had ever built assumed that first contact would begin with 2 parties trying to understand each other, 2 parties interested in connection. Nobody had built a model for this. Nobody had imagined that the first formal contact between humanity and an interstellar civilization would consist of them sending us a demand and us sending back 4 words that essentially amounted to a politely worded rejection slip. I filed my first observation report that night. I noted that the Conclave had made a foundational error in their opening move. They had assumed that humanity, upon learning it was not alone in the universe, would experience the same response every other species apparently had: awe, anxiety, a desperate desire to belong, to be accepted, to be granted a seat at the table of galactic civilization. They had not accounted for the possibility that humanity would read the invitation, check the terms, and decide the table was not worth sitting at. I sent my report to the division. I made coffee. I looked out the observation window at the cold scatter of stars and thought about what was going to happen next. I did not have to wait long. The second message from the Conclave arrived 8 days after the first. It was longer, considerably longer, 22 pages, with an additional 6-page appendix that I can only describe as a diplomatic explanation of why we had not understood the first message correctly, and why, upon reflection, we would surely see the wisdom of compliance. It was, in its own strange way, almost endearing. They had not considered the possibility that we understood perfectly. They had simply concluded that our silence was confusion. So they clarified. They expanded on the benefits of Conclave membership. They outlined the protections afforded to integrated civilizations. They offered slightly improved terms on the antimatter transfer timeline. They adjusted the population cap boundary by a margin of about 4%, which I calculated would allow us to keep roughly 2 more medium-sized colonies in the approved human sphere. There was also a new section. It was titled, Common Concerns of New Civilizations, and it addressed, in patient and somewhat condescending language, what the Conclave had apparently identified as the typical fears a newly contacted species would have: fear of losing cultural identity, fear of economic exploitation, fear of military subjugation, fear of being absorbed and erased. They had answers for all of it, reassuring answers, carefully worded, thoroughly footnoted, historically supported answers. Earth received the document. The Security Council read it. They sent back 3 words this time. Still not interested. I was in the signals room when that response went out. Lieutenant Kara Neville, my communications officer, read it off her screen, looked at me, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I feel like they are going to keep sending longer messages. She was right. I began keeping a private log at this point, separate from my official reports. Not because I planned to share it, but because I needed somewhere to put my thoughts that was not filtered through the formal language of military dispatches. What I was watching was unlike anything in the history of human diplomacy. We were not negotiating. We were not posturing. We were not playing a careful game of strategic delay. We were simply not engaging. And the effect of that non-engagement on a civilization built entirely around the art of engagement was fascinating and, at times, genuinely difficult not to find funny. The Conclave sent a third message 14 days after the second. This one was 31 pages. It included testimonials, apparently genuine ones, from member civilizations, describing the positive experience of integration. The Vithara, who were the oldest and most powerful Conclave members, contributed a personal message from their High Council, expressing what was described as warmth and openness toward humanity's potential place in the galactic community. There was a section on interstellar trade benefits that included projected economic growth models over a 200-year period. There was even a short passage acknowledging that the original mandate had perhaps been phrased in a manner that was overly formal, and that the Conclave wished to convey a more welcoming tone going forward. I read that passage 3 times. They were apologizing. Not directly, not explicitly, but they were as close to apologizing as a 3,000-year-old interstellar coalition had probably ever come in an opening exchange. They were softening. They were adapting their approach, because the previous approaches had not worked. Earth's reply came back in 6 hours this time. 2 words. No, thank you. I remember thinking, the addition of thank you was an interesting choice. It was not sarcasm. The Security Council does not do sarcasm in official transmissions. It was genuine. We were saying no. We were doing so politely. We were not angry, not afraid, not posturing for a better deal. We were simply declining, the way you decline a dinner invitation from someone you do not know, who has shown up at your door without warning and informed you that you are expected to attend. Here is what I did not know at the time, but learned later from intercepted internal Conclave communications. After that third reply, an emergency subsession was called among the Vithara High Council. The session lasted 9 hours. The topic was not military response or escalation. The topic was, what does it mean when a species responds to contact with consistent, polite refusal? They did not have a good answer. Their entire institutional memory, 3,000 years of it, was built on a single assumption. Every species, when confronted with the reality of a vast, organized, powerful galactic community, would ultimately want to join it. The desire to belong was, in their experience, universal. Species might push back on terms. Species might take years or even decades to formally integrate. But they always engaged. They always opened a channel. They always started talking, because talking was how you survived, and every species in the galaxy understood that. Every species except, apparently, us. I watched all of this from the Resolute. Our signals intelligence team had cracked the Conclave's secondary encryption layer by the end of the third week, which was somewhat embarrassing for them and extremely useful for us. My communications officer Kara and our intelligence analyst, a quietly brilliant man named Owen Marsh, worked 16-hour days parsing the intercepted traffic. Owen had a habit of printing the most interesting exchanges and pinning them to the wall above his console. By the end of the first month, the wall was nearly covered. His favorite, which he circled in red ink, was a line from a Vithara internal memo that read, "The humans may not have received the transmissions. We should resend. They resent the original mandate." All 3 subsequent messages. They also sent a new brief communication asking us to confirm receipt of all prior documents. Earth confirmed receipt. In 2 words. Confirmed, uninterested. The Conclave went quiet for 4 days after that. Owen said it was the longest gap in their outbound messaging traffic in the entire recorded history of their communication archives, which our intelligence team had also, at this point, partially accessed. 4 days of silence from an organization that had been continuously communicating for 3,000 years. I wrote in my private log, "I think they are afraid, not of our weapons or our fleets. They are afraid because they do not know what we want, and a species that does not appear to want anything is, to a civilization built on negotiation, the most frightening thing imaginable. You cannot negotiate with a species that has no visible needs. You cannot offer incentives to someone who is not looking for anything. You cannot find leverage where there is nothing to pull." Meanwhile, on Earth, things were moving. I was receiving briefings from the division every 48 hours. The antimatter research program had been quietly relocated to a deep space installation beyond the range of any known Conclave sensor array. The faster-than-light propulsion team, headed by a researcher named Dr. Philip Crane, had accelerated their testing schedule. The outer colony expansion had not slowed by a single ship. In fact, 3 new colony vessels had departed in the 6 weeks since the first Conclave message arrived. They were not making a public statement by doing this. They were just continuing what they had already been doing, because no one had given them a reason to stop, and we had not told them to. The Security Council had made one significant decision behind closed doors, which I learned about through a private channel from my division director. They had decided not to tell the public the full content of the Conclave's demands. Not to hide them exactly, but to delay. The reasoning was straightforward. The Conclave's mandate had included a confidentiality clause requesting that its contents not be disclosed to the general human population until after integration proceedings had begun. The Council had decided to honor exactly that much of the document. They had not disclosed the full contents. However, they had briefed the general public that contact had been made with an interstellar organization, and that Earth was reviewing the nature of the relationship. The public response, polled across 47 nations, was roughly what anyone who has spent time with human beings might have predicted. The top response, recorded in 31 of the 47 nations, was some variation of, "What do they want from us?" The second most common response, in 26 nations, was, "Why should we do what they say?" The third most common, in 19 nations, "Let's wait and see what they actually do." Not one of the top responses, in any nation, in any polled demographic, was, "We should comply immediately." I do not think the Conclave had modeled for that either. The fourth Conclave message arrived on day 41. I read it alone in my quarters at 02 o'clock station time, because that is when it came in, and I had left instructions to be woken for any incoming transmissions regardless of the hour. It was 47 pages long. I made coffee. I read it carefully. And somewhere around page 19 I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The tone was different. The earlier messages had been patient and somewhat superior. the tone of an organization that was used to waiting out resistance, because resistance always ended. This message had something else in it, something I recognized from a different context entirely. It had the careful, controlled language of an institution that was beginning to worry. The offers had expanded significantly. Conclave membership now came with full voting rights from day one of integration, something that was apparently unprecedented. The antimatter transfer was now framed as a temporary measure pending a joint review, not a permanent surrender. The population cap had been quietly removed from the document entirely, replaced with language about collaborative expansion planning. The historical precedent section from page 12 of the original mandate was gone. No mention of the 4 civilizations that had resisted. No more gentle implication of consequences. In its place, there was a new section. It was titled, "The Conclave's Commitment to Mutual Respect." I read it twice. It was genuine. Awkward and over-formal and clearly written by a committee, but genuine. They were not threatening. They were not escalating. They were trying, in the clumsy way of an organization that had never had to try before, to be appealing. I sent my observation to the division with a single line of personal note at the bottom. They are scared of what they do not understand, and what they do not understand is why we have not asked for anything. Earth received the 47-page message. The Security Council deliberated for 3 hours. Their reply was 8 words. We appreciate the message. Our position has not changed. The most words humanity had sent in any single reply. A small milestone. Owen Marsh printed it out and pinned it to his wall next to the Vathura memo about resending the transmissions. I went back to my observation log that night, and I wrote something that I later included, almost word for word, in my official report to the UN. I wrote, "The Conclave has spent 3,000 years operating on the assumption that every species in the galaxy ultimately wants the same thing, which is safety, legitimacy, and belonging. They are not wrong that those things matter to us. They are wrong about what we believe we need from them in order to have those things." Humanity had already built its own safety. Imperfect, hard-won, built on centuries of painful experience, but ours. We had our own legitimacy, defined not by membership in anyone else's coalition, but by our own continued survival and expansion. And as for belonging, well, we had each other. 8 billion people and counting, spread across a solar system and a handful of young colonies. A civilization that fought with itself constantly, but had, in the last century, developed a peculiar shared stubbornness about the idea that no one from outside got to tell us what we were. The Conclave had contacted a species that had been saying no to powerful institutions for its entire recorded history. Saying no to kings, to empires, to ideologies, to economic systems, to every structure that had ever claimed the right to define the terms of human existence. Saying no, sometimes paying a terrible price for it, and then getting back up and continuing anyway. They had sent their mandate to the wrong species. On day 58, the internal Conclave communications that Owen and Kara were intercepting began showing something new. Disagreement. Not the polished procedural debate of a functional institution, but genuine, fractured, heated disagreement. The 11-member civilizations were no longer aligned on approach. The Vithara still favored patience. 2 of the smaller member species, the Doroth and the Kelanti, were arguing for immediate escalation. 3 others were pushing for a radical change of strategy, abandon the integration framework entirely, and approach humanity as an equal rather than a candidate. The session logs from that period are some of the most remarkable documents I have ever read. An organization that had maintained unanimous consensus for most of its 3,000-year history was cracking along lines it had never imagined, and the cause of the crack was not a war, not a resource conflict, not a philosophical schism over governance. The cause was a species that had received their messages, understood them completely, and kept politely saying no. On day 63, the Conclave convened a formal emergency session, their first in over 800 years. The topic, as recorded in the session header that Owen pulled from their network that same night, was 3 words long. What do we do? I read that header. I sat with it for a long moment. Then I walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars, and thought about all the humans back on Earth who had no idea how thoroughly they had, simply by being themselves, broken something that had run without interruption for 3 millennia. I went back to my desk. I wrote in my log, "I think we are about to find out what 3,000 years of unchallenged assumption looks like when it meets its first real question." The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave lasted 4 days. I know this because Owen Marsh barely slept for any of them. He was at his console for most of those 96 hours, pulling intercepts, running translations, printing pages, and covering every available surface in the signals room with what I can only describe as the most remarkable political theater any human being had ever had the privilege of watching in real time. Let me tell you what I saw. The 11 ambassadors of the Galactic Conclave were, by any measure, extraordinary beings. Their civilizations spanned centuries of interstellar development. Their diplomatic traditions were older than most of Earth's written languages. They had navigated wars, resource crises, cultural collapses, and the slow, painful integration of species that had nothing in common except the fact of being alive and capable of reaching the stars. They were, in their own world, and by their own standards, the most sophisticated political minds in the known galaxy. They were also, it turned out, completely unprepared for us. The session opened with a formal address from the Vitara High Council, a figure our records identified only as Senior Voice Arath. I will not pretend I understood everything about the Vitara. Their biology was a mystery to us, their internal culture almost entirely opaque, but the language of the address translated cleanly, and what Senior Voice Arath said in those opening minutes was, in essence, this: "We have a problem we have never had before, and we need to solve it together before it gets worse." The problem, as Arath framed it, was not that humanity had refused. Species had taken years to comply before. The problem was that humanity had refused without asking for anything in exchange. Every prior species that had resisted integration had done so because they wanted better terms. They had held out for more favorable trade arrangements, for territorial guarantees, for security assurances, for recognition of their governing bodies. The resistance was always, at its core, a negotiating position, a starting point for the real conversation. Humanity had not started a conversation. We had simply declined to have one. Arath's words, as Owen translated them that first night, were striking. A species that wants nothing from you cannot be reasoned with, cannot be satisfied, and cannot be predicted. And a species that cannot be predicted is, by definition, the most significant variable in any strategic calculation. The Dorith ambassador spoke next. I had built a rough profile on the Dorith from our intelligence work over the past 2 months. They were a young member civilization, only about 400 years into interstellar travel, and they had integrated with the Conclave under considerable pressure roughly 2 centuries ago. Their ambassador, whose name translated approximately as Voice of the Collective Shorath, had a reputation within Conclave records for directness, which in Conclave terms apparently meant a willingness to say things others were thinking but preferred not to voice. Shorath said, in translation, "We should make clear to the humans what resistance has historically cost. We did not take our time in integrating, and we have no regrets. They should be reminded that the alternative to cooperation is not continued independence. It is irrelevance, or worse." There was a silence in the session logs after that statement. Owen flagged it. A pause in the transcript that lasted nearly 3 minutes by Conclave recording standards, which I had learned was a significant gap. Conclave sessions moved quickly. 3 minutes of silence was the equivalent of a stunned audience. The Kelanti ambassador, Voice Marin Sol, broke the silence. What Marin Sol said next was what changed the entire direction of the session, and I want to be precise about it because I think it matters. Marin Sol said, "We have read the human archives. Our analysis team has been working on their transmitted data for 61 days. Books, historical records, strategic documents, entertainment, all of it. I want the Council to understand something before we discuss any form of pressure or escalation. These beings have a word for what we are proposing. They use it across hundreds of their historical conflicts. The word is ultimatum, and in their entire recorded history, across every culture, every political system, every era of their development, there is not a single recorded instance where issuing an ultimatum to these beings produced the desired result. Not one. What it produces, consistently, across every case our analysts reviewed, is a hardening of position. The more direct the pressure, the more absolute the refusal. Another silence in the logs, longer this time. I read that passage 3 times. Then I walked down the corridor to Owen's console and read it over his shoulder a 4th time, because I wanted to make absolutely sure the translation was accurate. It was. The Kalanti had done their homework. They had read us. Not the way the original mandate had read us, as a primitive species requiring management, but genuinely. They had gone into our history and come out the other side, understanding something that the Vithara had not. That humanity's refusal was not a position, it was a personality. The session fractured after Marin Sol's address. Fractured is the precise word. Not collapsed, not ended, but broke into pieces that kept moving in different directions. The Vithara maintained their position of strategic patience. Wait, continue sending messages. Allow the 90-day window to pass and then assess. Do not escalate. The Dorith and Kalanti initially pushed for escalation. Show of force. A fleet movement to the edge of the approved human sphere. Not an attack, not even a genuine threat, but a visible demonstration of capability. Something to remind humanity that the Conclave's patience was not the same thing as helplessness. 3 other member civilizations, the Araxi, the Soon, and a loose collective the Conclave records called the Mirak Accord, argued for something different. They wanted to abandon the integration framework entirely, not give up on humanity, but approach us differently, as a peer, without the mandate, without the 90-day window. Start over, from zero, with an honest introduction instead of a demand. 2 more civilizations were not sure what they wanted, and spent a great deal of the session saying so in elaborate and carefully diplomatic ways. The final 2, whose names translated as the Gathered Voices of Parath and the Long Line of Solak, said almost nothing during the main sessions, but filed lengthy written positions afterward that Owen summarized for me over a meal in the mess hall on the 3rd day. The Parath thought humanity was a contained anomaly that would eventually come around on its own, and the Solak believed the entire situation was the result of a flawed initial approach, and that responsibility lay with whoever had drafted the original mandate. Nobody was unified, nobody was calm. The Conclave, which had produced unanimous votes on matters of galactic governance for the better part of 3 centuries, could not agree on what to do about a single species that had, so far, done nothing except not reply to their messages. I wrote in my private log on the 3rd day of the session, they are discovering that the absence of action can be as destabilizing as action itself. We have not threatened them. We have not moved a single fleet unit into a position that could be read as aggressive. We have not publicly denounced them, not made demands of our own, not attempted to contact other species to build a counter-coalition. We have simply continued existing, continuing our own programs, and declining to engage. And that continued, quiet, total non-engagement is more frightening to them than anything we could have done with weapons. I thought about why that was. I thought about it for a long time, through that 3rd night and into the 4th morning, while the emergency session moved toward its conclusion without reaching one. Here is what I concluded. The Conclave's power, all of its authority and influence and stability, rested on a single thing: the universal assumption that integration was the natural destination of every spacefaring species. That assumption was not just a belief. It was the foundation of everything the Conclave built. If species always integrated, then the Conclave's power was inevitable, its rules were permanent, its history was a straight line pointing in one direction. Remove that assumption, even in one case, even for one species, and the entire structure became something different. It became a choice. And if membership was a choice, then every member species could, in theory, look at their own history and ask whether they had genuinely chosen, or whether they had simply been made to feel that they had no other option. That was what humanity was doing to the Conclave, without firing a shot or raising a voice. We were making membership look optional, and that was the most dangerous thing we could possibly have done to them. On the 4th day, Senior Voice Aerith called the session to a formal close without a resolution. In 3,000 years of Conclave records, this had happened exactly twice before. Both previous times had preceded significant internal restructuring. Owen found this detail in the archive and highlighted it in yellow. He pinned it to his wall. The session closed with a procedural motion, passed narrowly. to authorize the Vetara High Council to open an unofficial back-channel communication with the human representative most recently identified in Earth's public records as the senior envoy on station. That was me. I found out about this authorization, naturally, by reading their intercepted internal communications the following morning. I was not surprised. I had been expecting something like this. Not a formal session, not another mandate, not an escalation, something quieter, something off the record. What I did not expect was who they would send. The request for a private channel came through on day 72. It was addressed to me by name and rank, which told me they had been paying attention to our personnel records. The message was short, 7 sentences, and the tone was unlike anything the Conclave had sent before. There were no footnotes, no references to previous documents, no formal headings. It read less like a diplomatic transmission and more like a note passed between colleagues. It was signed, Ambassador Kaelsoth, Dorvaki Representation, Galactic Conclave. The Dorvaki, not the Vithara, who had led every prior communication. The Dorvaki were a mid-tier civilization, not the oldest or the most powerful, but according to our intelligence analysis, they had a specific distinction. They were the ones who had read our archives most thoroughly. Their analysis team had been working on human historical and cultural materials since day 3 of the contact window. They had read more of our literature, our history, our philosophy than any other Conclave member. I accepted the channel request. I sat down at my private console in my quarters, poured a glass of water, and opened the connection. Kaelsoth appeared on screen as a visual representation, because direct visual contact was apparently the Dorvaki preference. The translation software handled the rest. He looked, to my human eyes, something like a tall, thin figure, composed primarily of careful stillness. His face was expressive in ways I could not yet fully read. His eyes, for lack of a better word, were patient. He said, "I want to speak honestly and off the record. I am not here on behalf of the Conclave's official position. I am here because I believe I am the only one among our membership who actually understands what is happening, and I think we have been making a mistake since the first day, and I would like to see if it can be corrected." I said, "I am listening." He said, "The Council believes your silence is a strategy, a calculated move. They have spent 72 days trying to determine what you are holding out for, what the price of your cooperation is, what terms would satisfy you. I have spent 72 days reading your history, and I believe they are wrong. I believe you are not holding out for anything. I believe you genuinely do not want what we are offering." I said, "That is correct." There was a pause. He said, "Then I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because the answer will determine whether the next 100 years are difficult for both our peoples or merely complicated. What would it take?" I said, "There is nothing. I mean that plainly. There is no offer, no concession, no restructured mandate that would produce a different answer, because the answer is not about the terms. The answer is about the question itself. You asked us to integrate on your timeline, by your rules, under your oversight. That is not something we do. It is not about whether your offer is good. It is about the fact that you assumed you had the right to make it." Another pause, longer. He said, "I expected that answer. I told the Council something like it would be the answer. They did not believe me." I said, "What did they think I would say?" He said, "They thought you would have a number, a price, a demand, something we could meet or negotiate toward. The idea that a species might simply object to the structure of the interaction itself, not its content, is not something our models account for." I said, "I noticed." He said, "I want to be honest with you about something else. The Council is divided, more divided than at any point in the past several centuries. Your refusal has done something to us that no military confrontation, no resource crisis, no territorial dispute has ever done. It has made several of our member civilizations look at their own integration history and wonder whether what they experienced was truly a choice or something else. The Doroth, who advocate most strongly for escalation, are doing so in part because they do not want to ask that question about themselves. It is easier to insist that integration is inevitable than to examine whether their own was." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I am sorry for the difficulty. I am not sorry for the position, he said. I did not expect you to be. We spoke for another hour and 40 minutes. I will get to the content of the rest of that conversation in the next section, because it matters, and I want to give it the space it deserves. But I want to capture here the quality of that first exchange, the texture of it, because it was unlike anything I had experienced in a career built on cross-cultural communication. Kale Soth was not trying to persuade me. He had stopped trying to persuade before the call began. He was trying to understand. And there is a profound difference between those two things. One of them is what every prior conclave communication had attempted. The other was what this one was. I had been prepared for another version of the mandate, another offer, another framing, another careful repositioning of the same fundamental demand. I had not been prepared for an alien diplomat who had read enough human history to know that none of that would work, and had come, instead, simply to ask questions and listen to the answers. When the call ended, I sat in my quarters for a long time. I made notes. I looked at the stars. Then I filed a report to the division that contained, among other things, a line that I think my division director found alarming. I believe the conclave is changing. Not just their approach to us, their understanding of themselves. And I believe we did that by doing nothing more than being exactly what we are. I did not know, that night, how right I was, or how far that change would reach. The second call with Kale Soth happened 2 days after the first, and this time he told me something I had not been expecting. He said, I want you to know that I had to argue for 3 hours with the Vithara High Council, just to make this call. They agreed only because they have run out of other ideas. I am the last option before they move to something I would rather not see them move to. I said, what is that? He said, the Doroth and the Kalanti have put forward a formal motion for a visibility demonstration, a fleet presence at the edge of your colonized space. Not an attack, they are careful to say that, but visible, undeniable, something your population and your government cannot ignore. I said, and you think that would work? He said, I think it would be catastrophic. I have read your history. I know what happens when someone shows up at your border with a fleet and calls it a demonstration. You do not read it as a warning. You read it as a first step. He was not wrong. I told him so. He said, then I need you to help me give the council something else. Not an agreement. I am not asking you to agree to anything. I am asking you to give me something I can take back to them, something that shows this conversation is real, that you are a people worth understanding rather than a problem to be managed. I said, I have been talking to you for 2 days. Is that not something? He said, you have been talking to me. The council needs to know that you are talking to humanity's government as well, and that the conversation means something. They need to believe that there is a path forward that does not require integration on the original terms. I said, there is. It is the path where you treat us as what we are, which is an independent civilization that you have decided to contact. Not a candidate for membership, not a species under evaluation, not a problem requiring a solution, just a civilization, one that might, over time, find its own reasons to engage with yours, in ways that work for both of us, on a timeline that nobody set in advance. There was a long pause. Kale Soth said, that is not a framework the Conclave has used before. I said, I know. He said, I am not sure the council will accept it. I said, I know that too. But it is the only honest answer I can give you, and I think you knew that before you asked. Another pause. He said, yes, I did. What happened next was slow. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything changed, but over the following 10 days, something shifted in the Conclave's internal communications that Owen and Kara were monitoring. The session logs became less heated. The Doroth's motion for a fleet demonstration was tabled, then quietly withdrawn. The Vethera began a series of closed consultations with the Araxi, the Soon, and the Mirak Accord, 3 of the civilizations that had been pushing for a complete reset of the approach. On day 84, 6 days before the original 90-day compliance deadline expired, the Conclave sent Earth a new message. It was short. 1 page, no footnotes, no appendices, no historical precedent section. It said, the Galactic Conclave acknowledges the independent standing of the human civilization. The integration directive issued under Mandate 7741C is formally suspended pending a full review of Conclave engagement protocols. We extend an open invitation to any future communication at a time and in a format of humanity's choosing. We ask nothing in return for this invitation. Earth received the message. The Security Council read it. They sent back 6 words. We receive this. We will consider. Not yes, not no, not a rejection, and not an acceptance. Just, we receive this. We will consider. I think those 6 words were the most honest thing we could have said. Because they were true. We would consider, in our own time, without a deadline, without anyone standing over us telling us what the answer had to be. When I read the Conclave's message in my quarters that evening, I thought about the years I had spent studying diplomacy, the careful architecture of formal engagement, the rules about language and posture and the correct degree of warmth to convey in an opening position. All of that training had prepared me for a world where 2 parties sat down and talked, where there was an agenda and a timeline and a mutual interest in reaching an agreement. None of it had prepared me for what had actually happened, which was that humanity had, without planning to, without a strategy session or a diplomatic brief or a formal decision from the Security Council, accidentally discovered something that 3,000 years of conclave history had never encountered: the power of simply not needing, not indifference. We were not indifferent to the conclave, not hostility. We had no desire to harm them or undermine them, not arrogance. We knew very well that the galaxy was vast, and that we were, by most measures, a young and relatively small civilization finding its way. But we did not need their approval. We did not need their protection. We did not need their timeline or their framework or their carefully managed version of what our future should look like. And because we did not need those things, no one could use them as leverage. And without leverage, the entire machinery of managed integration, 3,000 years of it, had simply stopped working. Kale Soth sent me a private message the day after the formal communication went to Earth. It was the shortest thing he had ever sent me. 5 words. I think you understand now. I sent back 5 words of my own. We understood from the beginning. 6 months later, I am sitting in this debriefing room with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of notes, and an official request from the Secretary General to write all of this down in a form that can be reviewed, archived, and eventually, I suppose, read by whoever comes after us. Let me tell you what the world looks like now. The Galactic Conclave still exists. We did not break it. That was never the goal. The goal, to the extent that we had one, was simply to continue existing on our own terms, and we did that. The Conclave is intact. It is also, by every measure our intelligence teams can assess, profoundly different from the institution that sent us that first 14-page mandate 7 months ago. 2 of the 11 member civilizations have reached out to Earth, through independent channels that bypass Conclave protocol entirely. The Erupts contacted our outer colonies directly with a proposal for a scientific exchange. No terms, no integration language, no compliance requirements. Just, here is what we know. Here is what we think you might find useful. We are interested in what you are working on. Our science division responded with cautious enthusiasm. Conversations are ongoing. The Merak Accord, the loose collective of smaller civilizations that had argued most strongly for treating us as a peer, sent a longer message that arrived at the UN directly. It was addressed not to a department or a division, but simply to humanity. It acknowledged that the Conclave's opening approach had been wrong. It said so plainly, without diplomatic softening. It expressed genuine curiosity about who we were, and how we had built what we had built, and it invited any form of engagement we found comfortable, at any pace we found acceptable. The Secretary General personally drafted the response to that one. I am told it took her 2 drafts and 1 long walk to find the right words. What she sent was warm, not cautious, not formal, not careful in the way of a government managing a sensitive relationship. Warm, human. It mentioned our history, not the polished version we put in formal briefings, but the actual history, the part with the wars and the mistakes, and the long, painful process of building something together out of all the wreckage. I heard she cried a little, writing it. I believe it. The Dorith have gone quiet. Our intelligence suggests they are having internal debates about their own integration history, the ones that Kale Soth had predicted, what they conclude, and how long it takes them to conclude it. is their process. We are not part of it. We do not need to be. The Vethera have not sent a new message, not one word since the formal suspension notice. I do not know what is happening inside the High Council. I expect it is complicated. I expect there are people within that institution who believed for their entire lives that what they were doing was right, good, and necessary, and who are now looking at a single data point, a young species with barely a century of interstellar capability, that said no, and meant it, and did not fall apart, and wondering what that means for everything they thought they knew. I hope they work it out. Genuinely. I bear the Vethara no bad feeling. They did what their entire institutional history told them to do. It just did not work this time, and that is not something I need to celebrate. It is something I hope they learn from. Owen Marsh was promoted 2 months ago. He is now running the Conclave intelligence unit from a desk in Geneva. He still prints things out and pins them to the wall. His new wall, I am told, is already half covered. Kara Neville requested a transfer to the new Araxi Liaison Division, which was created 3 weeks ago and is currently staffed by 12 people who all volunteered. She was accepted immediately. She sent me a message on her first day that said, "This is the strangest and best job I have ever had." Dr. Philip Crane's faster-than-light propulsion team announced a successful controlled test jump 4 weeks ago. The jump covered a distance of roughly 3 light minutes. It is a small jump. It is also the first time human technology has moved a physical object faster than light, and what it means for the next decade of our expansion is difficult to fully articulate. The Conclave knows about it. We did not tell them. They found out through their own observation networks. No message came in response. I think they are deciding how to feel about it. I think they have a lot of decisions to make. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I want to make sure is in this record, because I think it is the most important thing I have to say. What happened here was not planned. The Security Council did not convene a strategy session and decide that the correct approach to first contact with an interstellar coalition was dignified silence, followed by polite, absolute refusal. Nobody wrote a playbook. Nobody ran simulations. Nobody decided in advance that the way to reshape the power dynamics of galactic civilization was to say no thank you and mean it. It happened because of what we are, because of what centuries of being human had made us. We had lived long enough with powerful institutions telling us what to do, that we had, somewhere in our collective bones, developed an immunity to it. Not a perfect immunity, not a principled philosophy, just a deep, tired, hard-won refusal to assume that the loudest voice in the room was automatically the one we should listen to. The Conclave was the loudest voice any of us had ever heard. A 3,000-year-old interstellar coalition with 11 member civilizations and a fleet capacity we could barely estimate, and a bureaucratic infrastructure that had successfully integrated every species it had ever contacted. By every rational measure, they should have been the voice we listened to. We listened, we just did not agree. And the gap between those two things, between hearing something and agreeing to it, between understanding a demand and accepting it as legitimate, that gap is what the Conclave had never encountered before. They had met species that could not hear them, species that did not understand, species that were afraid, or angry, or desperate. They had never met a species that heard them perfectly, understood them completely, and quietly said, "No." I am proud of that. I want to be clear about it. I am proud of the 4 words we sent, and the 3 words, and the 2 words, and the 6 words. I am proud of the scientists who kept working, and the colony ships that kept flying, and the population of 8 billion people who largely went about their lives with the calm confidence of a species that has survived too much to be easily frightened. I am proud of Owen, and his wall of printed intercepts, and Kara and her calm voice reading our replies out loud, and the Secretary General who cried while writing a warm letter to strangers in the stars. I am proud because we did not do it with weapons. We did not do it with threats. We did not do it by being larger, or older, or more powerful. We did it by being exactly what we are, which is a species that has spent its entire history learning, at great cost, that strength does not automatically confer legitimacy, and size does not automatically confer wisdom, and age does not automatically confer the right to tell someone else what their future looks like. We are not perfect. We are not wise. We are not the heroes of this story in any simple sense. We are just human, stubborn and curious, and occasionally infuriating and absolutely, completely unwilling to be told who we are supposed to be by someone who decided in advance that they already knew. The Conclave sent us a mandate. We sent back 4 words. They sent us 47 pages. We sent back 8 words. They sent us an open invitation. We sent back 6 words. And in all of that, in all those months of silence and short replies and polite refusals, something enormous quietly changed. Not just between us and them, inside them. The question they had never allowed themselves to ask, the question of whether what they built was a community or a system, had been forced into the open by a species that simply kept being itself. I do not know what comes next. I want to be honest about that. I do not know how the Araxi exchange will develop, or what the Mirak Accord will become, or whether the Dorith will work through their history and come out somewhere better, or stay locked in defensiveness. I do not know how long it will take before humanity and the Conclave, if the Conclave survives in its current form, find a way to exist alongside each other that works for everyone. I know it will be complicated. Everything with us is complicated. That is, I suspect, not going to change. What I know is this. The faster-than-light program is moving. The colonies are growing. The conversations with the Araxi and the Mirak Accord are real and ongoing, and full of the kind of genuine curiosity that makes diplomacy feel like what it is supposed to feel like, which is 2 parties trying to understand each other, rather than one party managing another. And somewhere in the Conclave's records, in whatever archive holds the history of their 3,000 years of integration, there is now a note, a data point, an anomaly, a species that heard the mandate, understood it, and did not comply, a species that asked for nothing and refused to be handled, and kept building its own future on its own timeline, while the most powerful organization in the known galaxy sent it increasingly long messages that it received, acknowledged, and chose not to act on. That note will not go away. The species who read it, all 11 of them and their descendants and whoever comes after them, will have to reckon with what it means. That integration is not inevitable. That cooperation requires genuine consent. That the galaxy is not a system to be managed but a collection of different kinds of alive, each with its own history, and its own stubbornness, and its own slow, hard understanding of what it will and will not accept. We taught them that, not by being great, just by being ourselves. I close my report here. Outside the window of this debriefing room, the city is moving the way it always moves, fast and loud and full of people going about their lives. They do not know, most of them, exactly what happened. They know contact was made. They know we did not join anything. They know things are changing in ways that are not yet fully clear. They are taking it, mostly, in stride. That does not surprise me. That has never surprised me. The Secretary General tells me the Conclave has sent a new message. It arrived this morning. I have not read it yet. I will read it this afternoon, over a better cup of coffee than this one, and then I will decide when to respond and what to say, and how much of the long human history of not being managed we need to bring to bear on whatever they are asking this time. We are in no hurry. We never were. The fastest word in any language, the one that moves fastest and hits hardest and changes the most in the least amount of time, is not a threat. It is not a declaration. It is not a promise of force or an offer of alliance or a proclamation of strength. It is just this: no. Said quietly, said clearly, said without anger, and without fear, and without any need for the person hearing it to understand why, because the reason does not belong to them anyway. That is the word we taught the galaxy. That is the word they will carry forward. We said it, and we meant it, and the universe changed.